Good afternoon. My name is Thomas Moore, and I'm in Dresden, Tennessee, July 28, 2005, to interview George C. Thomas. This interview is taking place as part of the Legal History Project of the Fellows of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Would you state your full name?
George C. Thomas, Jr.
What does the middle initial C stand for, Mr. George?
Connor.
Connor. Mm-hmm. Now, I started out by calling you Mr. George. That's the way I've always referred to you. If you want me to call you something else, I'll be glad to do that. But
call whatever you want.
Okay, thank you.
I've answered to a lot of things.
When were you born, Mr. George?
November the 3rd, 1918. Where
were you born?
I was born in Dresden. My parents were living in Greenfield, but my father was in World War I, and mother was over at Dresden with her parents, and that's where I was born.
Can you tell us a little bit about your family heritage? Who were your maternal and paternal grandparents?
My maternal grandparents were W.B. Shannon and I can't remember. Yeah. And paternal grandfather was Bob Thomas, and he lived up in Mound City, Illinois. So,
how did Bob Thomas or Dr. George Thomas end up in Greenfield?
Well, he first ended up in Columbus, Kentucky, and apparently wasn't doing very well there, and he heard about Dr. Padfield in Greenfield was about to sell a medical practice, and he came down and bought it, and that's how he got to Greenfield. And
well, go ahead and tell me about your parents. Who were your parents? Who were your parents?
My parents?
Yes, sir.
My mother's name was Georgia Shannon. She was a Shannon. And George was, my father was, of course, George Sr.
And your father was a medical doctor?
He's a medical doctor, yeah.
Was he in the service?
Yes, he was in the medical corps in the service. In fact, that's where he was when I was born.
Where was he stationed in the service? Did he see any action overseas?
Yeah, he was over in, I can't remember the name of the place, in the hospital over in Virginia. I can't remember the name of the hospital now.
Then he was a practicing physician in Weakley County?
In Greenfield for many years.
Well, what was that like to be a doctor in Greenfield, Tennessee, back in those days?
Well, back in those days, you damn near starved to death. You know, that was back before welfare or Social Security. People didn't have any money. You know, they had doctor, but they couldn't pay him. So it wasn't all that bad. But my mother taught school. That's how we got along financially a long time. My father worked hard, but he just didn't make any money. And then early in life, he had Alzheimer's. And he had that the last several years of his life.
How old were you when he first was diagnosed with that problem?
Oh, 50, I guess.
Okay. Oh, he was 50 when he was diagnosed.
He was. When I said 40, I guess. Anyway, he was about 60 at the time.
Okay. Did you ever go with him on any of his house calls, or?
Went with him a lot, particularly in the wintertime. You know, we didn't have any gravel roads in those days. He carried me with him to help him push the buggy out of the ditch, you know. So I went with him a lot. I'd have to sit out in the buggy and get cold while he was inside doing whatever. Yeah, I went with him a lot. And a lot of times he'd ride a horse, and if he did, I'd take my pony and ride along with him, you know. So back when it got too muddy even for the buggies, he'd ride a horse and put his his doctoring equipment in the side saddles. So, yeah.
Did you ever consider becoming a doctor yourself?
Never did. I had enough of it. I never did. No.
Well, were any of your relatives involved in the legal profession?
Oh, some of them, but not immediate relatives.
Well, tell me about your brothers or sisters. Did you have any other siblings?
Had one brother who was 7 years older, and he died several years ago. He did a lot of things. I remember one thing, he ran a feed and fertilizer store there in Greenfield. I worked for him. I was about 16, I guess. He got in oats, feed oats, in big 160-pound bags. And they'd come in on a freight car, and it was my job to go unload the freight car. And they weighed about 150 pounds apiece. So, yeah, I worked for him. And
what was his name?
Shannon. He was named for mother's parents.
Tell us about growing up in Greenfield, Tennessee. Was that during the Depression that you grew up there?
Yeah, it was during the Depression. Sure was, you know. But I had a good, I made it fine. Of course, mother was a school teacher, English teacher, among other things, and she taught me to write. In fact, I was writing by the time I was 9 and 10 years old. I mean, writing themes and things. And, you know, she taught there 40 years and taught everybody in Greenfield. All of them called her Miss Georgia. But she was, and she had me working. She wouldn't let anybody sit around. By the time I was 7 years old, she had me out in the field, Ralph McCumbers, carrying water to the hands. And I worked out there till I got big enough to handle a shovel, and we planted potatoes and sweet potatoes. And I worked in the pack sheds. He had the strawberry patch. Worked in the pack shed. I worked out there all one summer. Ralph's wife and my mother were cousins, and she saw to it I worked. And if I wasn't out there, she had me mowing yards for the neighbors. You didn't sit around, Miss Georgia, I'll tell you that.
It doesn't sound like it. How many people lived in Greenfield back in those days?
Oh, just about as many as there are now. I guess about 1,500, I think. Yeah.
Who were some of your best friends back then? Who'd you run around with?
Well, let's see. Phil Harris and Bill Nathan Dewberry and Barnett Hummel, Chester Porter. They were some of my close friends. And all of them are gone but Phil. Of course, Phil's still around.
I've always heard about a street over in Greenfield that they call Soup Street.
Yeah, I remember Soup Street.
Were you ever involved in any incident over there? Or knew anything personally about it?
Not personally, but I was up there on the corner where the Greenfield drugstore was then, and one Sunday afternoon, and I don't know what happened, but something happened on Soup Street, and Doran was his last name. He came up there and shot a fella and killed him on Soup Street. Yeah, sure did. And you know, they didn't do anything to him back in those days. You just took it as it was. And maybe they shouldn't have. I don't know what.
Well, that's Main Street. Why did they call it Soup Street?
Well, they had 3 or 4 restaurants on it. About all they served was soup. So, yeah, there's poor restaurants, and yeah, you couldn't even get a hamburger. I don't get the soup. And,
Well, tell me about your education, your early education in Greenfield. Where did you go to school? Where did you start school? When did you start school? That kind of thing.
Well, I started school when I was 5 years old. Miss Georgia sent me to school when I was 5 years old. And I went to the Greenfield schools. Went there till I finished in 1935, I believe. I believe it was 1935. And most of my educational years I studied hard. The last few years I studied girls more than I did books. But I didn't finish at the top of my class, but I was 3 or 4 down, I guess. And I played football, basketball, and baseball. Back in those days, I had a baseball team. And it didn't last too long. But anyway, we wound up football and basketball. And I was a pretty good football player. I went to Union, had a football team in those days. I went down there on a scholarship. And I wasn't down there but a week. They had a coach named Hollingsworth. He was a slave driver, if there ever was one. So I made it out the week. And I was in such shape I didn't feel like going to meals. But anyway, I made it a week, and I caught a ride to Greenfield. And I told my father, who was a football addict, I said, if that's the way football is, I don't want any of it. But I started going to UT Junior College, which was to Old Martin, just, 12 miles away. And riding back and forth with Howard Cochran in the car, about 5 hours, riding back and forth. And nobody had any money for room and board. And every Dare Bear was coached. He taught English and coached. And he saw me one day, he said, won't you come out for football? I said, well, to tell you the truth about it, I'm really not interested in it, and I have to leave every day at 5 o'clock to go home. He said, well, if you'll come on out, you can leave anytime you need to. And then I said to him, I don't know whether I like playing football at the college level or not. He said, well, come on out, and if there's some exercise you don't want to do, just don't do it. And won't nobody say a word to you. And I thought, boy, that's strange. But I went out, and he was the nicest man I ever knew. He and Sonny Humphreys was assistant, and Phil Dickens. And we had a fine football team. Didn't lose a game all year. We beat 4 four-year colleges, beat Delta State, beat Union, beat Lambeth, beat Austin Peay. Didn't lose a game all year. And the next year, we're not as good. Dare Bear left, went to Murray as head of the English department. He was a fine scholar. But anyway, so I played all the time I was there. I played basketball under Grantham. Grantham wasn't the coach at Dare Bear was. But anyway, we had a reasonably good basketball team. Red Burdette was on that team. And a boy named Jones, great big boy from out at Stella Ruth.
How tall are you, Miss George?
I'm about 6'4".
And how tall was Red Burdette?
6'8".
Is that right?
Yeah, he was big.
I knew he was tall. I didn't know how to.
And a fine scholar, hell of a mathematician, scholar.
Let's go back to the Greenfield schools, if you don't mind, just a minute.
Right.
Were there any teachers or instructors over there that were particularly interesting or influential in your life?
Oh, I remember J.B. Reed, who was principal of the grammar school. If you misbehaved a little, he said, I'll pop your jaws. And by golly, he would too. He'd pop your jaws. I've seen him pop a lot of jaws. Couldn't get by with it now, but it did in those days. But we were on what's called Happy Hill. That was an eighth grade up on that hill, 8th grade school up on that hill. And when I finished there, mother taught second grade there. And of course, I went to school to her. Tell you this little deal. And there's a little blonde-headed girl there, prettiest little girl I ever saw, Annie Lee Patterson. And Annie Lee and I went in the Solvent closet area there, and we were, I guess, necking or something, just like kids. And mother called us. Boy, we've got a whipping, I tell you what. Always. I thought about that a lot.
What was your deportment like in school?
Most of the time it was all right. I didn't have any real problems.
Well, tell me about, there was kind of an incident one time, I understand, with David Halliburton when you were in school.
Yeah, it did.
Explain that one to us.
David Halliburton. He taught science. And he and I didn't get along very well. No particular problem, just didn't get along.
Is this when you was in high school?
In high school. And we were in the study hall one time, and I was misbehaving. I don't remember what I was doing, not much, but I was misbehaving. And he came over and said something to me, and I said something back to him. And he picked up a book and slapped me in the face with a book. Well, I picked him up and set him had a big wastebasket, set him in a wastebasket. Yeah. Much of the consternation of the school, and of course, Bullington was the principal then. He sent me home, and I got home, saw my daddy out in the horse lot. He said, "Well, did you misbehave?" I said, "I guess I did." He said, of course, he was on the school board. He said, "Go on back to school." Apologized to him, go on back to school and apologize. And I did. And made it all right after that. Yeah.
Well, now you said there was a good team there at UT Junior College, but did you have some pretty good teams at Greenfield High School?
Greenfield High School had a great team. 1932 was an undefeated team. 33, 4, and 5.
In what sport now?
Football.
In football, okay.
Football. 3, 4, and 5 were a good team, but we weren't. 32 was a championship team. Played teams out of Memphis, nowhere. But the other years were good, but not great. Played basketball there. I guess I was a better basketball player than I was a football player. And we had a great basketball team. We played in the finals of the state tournament in Dyersburg. We didn't win, but we played in the finals. Had a good basketball team.
How many young people were in your class in the high school?
About 20 or 25. Yeah. There were about 100 and something in high school.
And still you went to the state tournaments. That's pretty good.
Yeah, sure did.
I want you to tell me about an incident that I've always heard about all my life, about a big fight that took place at the county basketball tournaments. You may have already been out of school at that time.
I was out of school.
Tell me about that fight.
But your daddy was involved in that.
I've always heard that.
Huh?
I've always heard that.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
In fact, I'm not sure he didn't start it. He and a boy from Gleason, and this Phelps boy from Gleason, good-sized boy, came in and got into it, sort of got to your daddy. And I grabbed him and hit him right on top of the head. At that time, I was wearing a big ring and it cracked his skull. but yeah, that was. But anyway, they didn't hurt your daddy.
But didn't the whole crowd erupt in a fight?
Yeah, well, not too bad. They did. People came down the floor, but school officials and police who were there and all, they got it settled for much problem.
Were you brought up in a religious family, Mr. George?
My mother went to the Baptist church every time the doors opened. And she had me going as long as I was under her wing. And I said to myself, if I ever get out of Miss George's influence, I'm going to quit this. And I did. I went to UT Knoxville, and I went to the Presbyterian there church some, and then I didn't go much of anywhere. And I was not particularly religious. And I remember when I got, quote, saved. You remember about getting saved? I was a little boy about 12 years old. They had a revival meeting in Greenfield. Had a preacher there from McEwen, Tennessee. I don't know why I remember that, but I do. And of course, when he gave the invitation, I went down and I was saved. Scared me to death, you know, scared me. He's preaching about hellfire and brimstone and all that stuff. Scared me. I thought, you know, that's child abuse. That's really child abuse. But that's the way they did it in those days. So,
well, tell me when you decided to go to college. Was it just understood that you would go, or?
Yeah. My mother understood me to go. Yeah.
Well, did your brother go before you?
Yeah, he went to Union before me. And that was while Daddy was practicing and making pretty good money. And he went to Union. That's where he met his wife, his first wife. The time I came along, well, Daddy was in the hospital, and finances were sort of low, and so I went. I said I went to Union on a football scholarship, but then that didn't pan out. In fact, I just left and went to UT Junior College, and Everett Derryberry took me under his wing, and I played there.
Well, tell me what UT Junior College is now, for those that don't know. There is no UT Junior College in Martin. So.
Well, UT Martin was UT Junior College.
Okay. And was it a two-year college when you went?
Two-year college, it was. And it was a good school.
Now, you said that at the end of your high school years, you were paying more attention to girls than your education. How was it over at UT Junior College?
Well, about the same thing, but yeah, was, yeah.
Did you enjoy partying more than you did the classroom, or?
Well, you know, I didn't. I did. I enjoyed partying a lot. In fact, I'd always made good grades, but I didn't make very good grades there that year in UT Junior College. It wasn't on my mind. And I was courting a girl about 5 nights a week, but anyway, I didn't do well. And
well, I am going to have to confess that I have read your autobiography, and you said in that autobiography that you had a nickname while you were there at UT Junior College.
Honky Tonk.
Say it again, sir.
Honky Tonk.
Honky Tonk.
Yeah, we went to the nightclubs every time the doors opened. That's when we didn't do well in school. Yeah. And you know, they called me Tonk there for a long time. Didn't bother me.
Well, when did you graduate from UT Junior College?
Yeah.
You graduated from there.
And then I went to UT Knoxville.
When did you start school up at UT Knoxville?
36. But
did you finish school there before the war?
Oh yeah. And let me tell you, I went to UT Knoxville and was not doing well. Was not studying, was not doing well. And as I said, the family finances were low, and so my brother Shannon came up there to see me one time. He was traveling for Swift then, Swift Fertilizer. He said, "You're not doing good, are you?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, I got you a job in Nashville." I said, "How'd you get a job in Nashville?" He said, "Well, you know Bill McAdams, our good friend from Greenfield. He ran the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company there in Nashville, and he and the cashier of the bank were close friends. And so with his influence, I went to work there at that bank. They paid me $70 a month, and I rented a room out near War Belmont, nice part of town. But being the Depression years that it was, they said I paid $40 a month, room and board, and rode to work on a streetcar. Cost a nickel to ride a streetcar, but if you bought a week's token, it's 3 cents. So that's where I got to work back on a streetcar.
Well, let me ask you, back at UT Knoxville, were you in a fraternity?
Yeah, I was in Delta Tau Delta. Shouldn't have been, but I was. And, yeah.
My mother-in-law was in school at UT Knoxville at the same time, and she tells me there's a legendary story about you there, and it involved a tuxedo. Could you tell us about that?
Well, I just tried to forget that. But we had a party, I guess a 2 or 3 day party. I'd been up all night and been to some kind of a gathering and had a tuxedo on. But I don't remember which class it was, but I'd taken all the cuts I could take. So the next morning, 8 o'clock, I went to that class with that tuxedo on and lasted through that class and the next one. And then I went to the fraternity house where I lived and took that tuxedo off and went to bed. But that happened. Yeah.
I thought she made it up, but you're telling us it's true.
It's true.
Well,
And let's see, Pappy Joe Wallen was next to me, and he kept Pappy Joe was a fullback on the football team. He kept punching me to keep me away. And Ed Malinsky was in that class. Ed Malinsky, one of the finest guards I ever had up there. Ed was on the other side. He punched me on the other side to keep me away.
Well, let's go to your experiences in the war. And
Okay.
tell me, were you drafted or did you join the service?
Well, at first, Harold Coates was a boy at Greenfield that I'd ridden horses with, known all my life. He said to me, let's go fly airplanes. And I said, well, that sounds like something we haven't done before, let's go. So we went to be examined, a physical. And he passed the flying colors, and I failed the color test. I didn't even know. I knew I had problems with colors, but I didn't know it made a difference. But I failed the color test. So I couldn't, they wouldn't take me. So I said, well, I'm not going to volunteer for anything else. So I went back to work at the bank. And guess what? The second group out of the draftees, I was in them. So I went to Fort Oglethorpe as a draftee.
What year would that have been, Mr. George?
1940. And I remember ran to Frank Markham there, Frank Markham from Tiptonville. Ran to Frank there, and Frank says, at Fort Oglethorpe Reception Center, he said, let's go ride horses. And I said, well, that sounds like fun, let's go. So went across the road there to the 6th Cavalry. And we joined that. He joined the headquarters company, and I joined A Troop. And that was in February, I think.
Oh, 40 or 41, what did you say?
We're talking about 41 now.
Okay.
February.
All right.
And ran in the mess hall. Barry Creek Spate was one of the mess attendants there. Anyway, Frank and I went over to the A Troop, and we were not there but a couple of months, and went to Louisiana maneuvers. And there all summer, fighting a war, and had one blanket and one shelter half. And there the whole summer. And of course, all of us had malaria. We were taking Ativan. Ativan is a yellow pill that makes you yellow. But anyway, it's supposed to ward off malaria. But we were there the whole, fighting this war. I remember one time, one morning, the Army was supposed to do something. And we got on our horses at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we rode till 4 o'clock the next morning. We rode 100 miles on a damn horse. Of course, most of the horses had saddle shores by the time we got there. But anyway, that was, and we rode through swamps, and we hadn't had any water. We left that morning. The Lister bag, which was where they had water, was about half empty, and we could just get a half a canteen of water. So it was hot that day, and so, of course, pretty soon we were out of water. And some of the soldiers would take the lanyard, which was around their necks to keep the pistols from falling off. They'd take that lanyard and wrap it around that canteen, and going through these swamps, filled up with that swamp water, and drink it. Well, every one of them got sick because swamp water to begin with, and horse manure with it, you know.
It doesn't mix well.
It mix well.
Now you're talking about, this is during basic training or some type of training exercise in Louisiana?
Yeah, it was Louisiana maneuvers. We went there.
So at Fort
The
Oglethorpe,
whole army was in Louisiana maneuvers.
at Fort Oglethorpe, you were put with a cavalry?
Went to A Troop in the cavalry, yeah.
And this is an actual horse cavalry.
Actually, horse cavalry, that's right. Rode horses. Had to go down every morning and clean the stables too. That was part of our job. Yeah.
How many horses would you have had in your unit, or?
Well, in the troop, it had about 200 horses. And we had, let's see, ABC, had 4 horse, and there's a horse mechanized regiment. Had 4 horse troops and there 4 mechanized troops. They had scout cars and motorcycles and that stuff.
Did you end up in officers' training school?
Yeah, and at the end of maneuvers in Louisiana, I was in the pup tent trying to eat lunch, and Sergeant Tower, our first sergeant, who was one of these 25-year military people, he came to me and said, "Thomas, I got an order for you." I said, "All right, Sergeant Tower." "Yes, sir." He handed it to me. He said, "It's an order to go to Fort Belvoir, officer training school." He said, "I just want you to know, if we wind up with officers like you, we'll lose the damn war."
Quite a recommendation from you.
Yeah.
So where was the officers' training school? What state?
Fort Belvoir, Virginia. Fort Riley, Kansas. I've been to Fort Belvoir, but this is Fort Riley, Kansas.
Who was in that officers' training school with you there?
Not anybody, not any local people. But we had, let's see, there was a Snowden boy from Memphis, those Rich Snowdens, and there was a lieutenant boy from the Borden Milk Heirs. He was there, and there was the son, Wadsworth, whose father was president of Pennsylvania Telephone Telegraph. See, a lot of these fellows are National Guard people. And we had a fellow there from New York that was in that Black Horse troop. Anyway, it was a mixed bunch. And most of them had a lot of military training, and I hadn't.
How did you end up in the officer school? Did you apply for that school?
Applied for it, yeah. Yeah, sure did.
How do you think you got in it? Because of your college education? Or?
Part of it, yeah, and I guess I was pretty good soldier. They called me in one day and said, "You want to go to officer candidate school?" I said, "Yeah." So that's where I went over. But they, I'm going to say that Fort Riley, Kansas was a different place.
Now, there was an officer in that school that you haven't mentioned yet. He may not have been in the cavalry, but was there at the same time at Fort Riley that became sort of famous later.
Who was that now?
Politician, possibly.
Who are we talking about?
Ronald Reagan?
Oh, Ronald. Oh, gosh, he was over in the basic officer course. They had two classes there. They had the officer candidate school and the basic officer. Yeah, he was there. Married to Jane Wyman at the time. And I thought a pretty decent fella. I don't know what happened to him, but wound up first class SOB, but he was a pretty decent fellow then.
What political party was he in at that time?
He was a Democrat then.
Is that why you thought a little more of him?
Well, that helped.
How old were you when all this was taking place there at officer training school?
22. I was 22.
Where were you first sent overseas? And to which theater of operation were you sent?
Well, let's see. From officer candidate school, I was sent to Fort Clark, Texas, down on the Mexican border. And we were there 3 or 4 months and went to Camp Stoneman, California, and loaded on a ship, the President Grant. And we went to New Caledonia. That's our first landing was New Caledonia.
Where is New Caledonia?
New Caledonia was where we landed. New Caledonia is a rather large island, about 400 miles from Australia.
So you went to the Pacific
Theater. Yeah, that's where we were, in the Pacific. And about the time we got to New Caledonia, Marines landed up in Solomon. Solomon's the north of New Caledonia. And so then after Marines sort of secured the Solomon, they thought, of course, the brash thought the Japs would come down from the Solomons to the New Hebrides and on into New Caledonia and all into Australia. But anyway, the Marines stopped them, and so there wasn't any reason for us to stay there, so they sent us over to New Guinea.
At New Caledonia, did they send your horses there as well?
We had horses there. We got horses from Australia.
Well, what happened to y'all's horses from Texas?
We were supposed to have horses when we got there, but the Japs sunk that ship, the horses, and so we were there maybe a month before another shipload of horses came. We had to train those horses. Most of them are wild. Had to train those horses. And we were there, about 6 months, I guess. And as I said, by that time, they'd stopped the Japs, and so they sent us over to New Guinea.
How was the Army planning on using the horses in operations?
New Caledonia was a mountainous island that had a general named Patch who was in charge of it. He thought he needed a horse regiment there to help in packing and all that sort of thing in the mountains. So that's the reason they had us there.
Was the Army already seeing that horses might be obsolete? Had they talked to y'all about that? Were there plans?
No, they hadn't. But it was the beginning of the end of that time. We had also not only a horse cavalry, we had a pack artillery outfit. Had mule pack artillery outfit, 75 millimeter. And so.
Did you ever use the horses in any combat operation you were involved in?
Never did. We left them in New Guinea, and I understood. I hear the Army sent them to India. I don't know why, but that's what I heard.
Did you ever see any of the famous generals of the war, officers?
Oh yeah, MacArthur. Yeah, I met MacArthur. He came to inspect our troop on New Guinea. And Kruger, I knew Kruger. He was head of the 6th Army then. But MacArthur was a decent fellow. We liked him all right.
Well, after you left your horses, did you receive any additional training in how to become an infantry
No,
soldier?
we just left the horses and walked. That's all it was to that. Of course, we'd had a lot of infantry training in the horse cavalry. But, and then they gave us, when we got to, I remember got to Leyte, one of the islands of the Philippines. We were low, of course, a lot of our boys either gotten killed or were sick or in the hospital. Or we didn't have many men left, and they sent us a bunch of boys. And they were from tank destroyer battalion. They didn't know a thing in the world about anything except tanks, and there weren't any tanks. We didn't have any tanks. But anyway, they'd broken up those outfits and sent them over as infantry. So we had those boys there.
Did you saw actual combat? Where did you see actual combat? What places?
Well, New Guinea, New Britain. New Britain was tough. We landed on the peninsula of New Britain, and the powers that be had said, well, you know, not any Japs there much. Well, they had a whole regiment of Japs there. And the powers that be said, you'll be up there at that river. There's a river at the base of this peninsula. Said, you'll be up there in 2 days. Well, I was there 6 weeks and we still weren't there. And in the meantime, they'd gotten in a regiment of infantry and a company of tanks. And with all those, we got through and did what we were supposed to do, but it took a long time, and that's where this boy died in my arms. We'd already had the tanks came in, and we were following these tanks up to the line, and this boy stepped on a landmine, one of our mines that the Japanese had taken and put in front of their lines, and killed him. Nice boy.
Can you share with us any other actual combat experience stories?
Well, I got a lot of those. We had combat on Woodlark Island. We had combat on Goodenough Island. The powers that be saw leapfrogging from one island to the next. And we had one unit on New Caledonia, these other units over here east of New Caledonia. So we did that till finally they ordered us into Alandia, which was at the very north of New Guinea. And we had a hard time there, but we finally got the battle over with, and they sent us to the Philippines, orders to the Philippines. We first went by the Admiralty Islands and on into the Philippines. And we landed on one of the islands called Leyte. And we didn't have much problem getting on the island. Well, the ships going up to the island, but this time the Japs had started these planes diving into the ships, and I saw one dive into the ship over to our right. Of course, it blew it up, lost all those boys, but none of them hit our ship. And we went on in, and didn't have much trouble getting in. Went up to a place called Carigary, and which was the north part of the Ormont Valley. And we went down that Omark Valley. And of course, it was lightly defended. There weren't all that many Japs. We didn't have all that much trouble. But we cleared that valley. That is where down there, I killed a Jap down in that valley, and he had a saber on him. So I got that saber, and I finally got to the supply sergeant. He sent it home. I've got that now. And then we captured a barn that's full of Jap horses, and it had saddles and all that there. So I got a saddle, and the saddle blanket was leather, fine saddle. So I got one of those and got the supply sergeant, sent it home. I've got that at home too.
Did you have any close calls where you feel like you almost were killed yourself?
Well, yeah, on New Britain. Listen, we'd go out there every day. The Japs had this fortified line. You couldn't see them. That this coconut plantation, the grass was head high, and you couldn't see anything. We'd just go and get killed, and go and get killed, go and get killed. But I know at one time I got up there pretty close, I thought. I had the canteen shot off my hip, but it didn't hit me. But I had a young officer there, a nice boy. He got hit in the back with some shrapnel, and he came by me and he said, "Captain, I've got to go to the aid station." I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "Well, I got hit in the back." I looked at his back. I could see his whole backbone had blown all the flesh off his back. And of course, they evacuated him, and I don't know what happened to that boy.
Tell me about any of the men that you fought with. Who was particularly brave? Any one person comes to mind?
Yeah, Walking Fuss was the bravest man I ever saw. Every time we had a dangerous mission, he wanted to go. And he'd fuss to go. And I sent him on a lot of them. He came back all right till finally he came back one time. He hadn't been hit, but he was talking funny. And I sent him to the aid station. They evacuated him. He'd had too much. If you had one ball could take this much, another ball could take that much, another ball could take that much. But soon you had all you could take. And he'd had all he could take.
How did y'all keep your spirits up in a situation like that?
Hoping you could come home. It's hard to do. There's a boy I went up on the line with one time. He was from New York. A great big boy, 6'4", weighed 240 or so. He'd been one of these fellows that made the living fighting these lesser bouts. And I thought he was going to win the war for us. Well, we got up there on the line, and he got his hand hit, 2 or 3 fingers blown off. And as the wind up with him, he left. I didn't see him anymore. Yeah.
Tell me about the battle at Dresden River.
Dresden River. Yeah, let me think about that. But yeah, that Dresden was 7 miles from the beach. And now why they sent us there, I don't know. But sent us, we were the last unit on that line, on that river. And so after the battle started, we pulled back. There was a big hill there. We pulled back to that hill. And many of us got on top of the hill, got around the hill, and dug foxholes And I never did know why we were there, but we were there. 32nd Division was on our right, and 31st Division was on the right of the 32nd. But we fought there for 30 days, I guess. And had the artillery observer was on this hill with me, and we kept shooting artillery in front of our line. And the chaps kept coming. I'd say, bring it down 25 yards. And he would, and I said, bring it down 25 yards. Finally he said, bring it down 25. He said, if I do, I'm afraid to put some of the shells in our boys. I said, well, I'd rather have you kill us than them. So he brought, and we killed, the next day when the battle was over, we counted 400 Japs right out in front of our line. And our only casualties was one foxhole. A Jap had gotten in one foxhole and killed 2 boys.
Did you receive any commendations, any awards from the military?
Well, you know, I wasn't all that brave. I got the Bronze Star and the Combat Infantry Badge, and I wasn't the bravest fellow that ever lived. Got through it.
Where was your last official combat duty position?
We were in the Philippines, and we were up at a place called Antipolo, and we cleared that place and had been there a while, and so they had a point system. You got so many points for every battle, and so many points for every amphibious landing and all that. And I had enough points to come home, and so I got on some ship, came home. On the way home, they dropped the bomb. In fact, when I landed in San Francisco, the war was officially over on August 14th. Yeah.
How did your combat experiences change you or affect you?
I don't know, made you happy every day you waked up in the morning. Glad to have one more day. That's about the whole thing.
How were you received when you got back home to the United States?
Well, but a lot of us, of course, I'd been over there so long, I had a lot of money, hadn't been able to spend any. And Mother had put it in the bank for me that Shannon hadn't spent. He spent a lot of it. That's my brother. But anyway, I went all over the United States, visiting various people I knew at various places. Spent a lot of time up at Fort Riley. I knew a lot of people up there. Went up to Fort Belvoir and Fort Hood, Texas. And I spent a lot of time.
What was your age at this point, Mr. George?
Uh, 24, I guess.
Were you ever injured in the service?
I was injured.
Were you in good health when you got back home to the States?
Well, that's a good question. No, I was not in good health. I weighed 160 pounds. When I went over on the ship, I remember I weighed 220 pounds. I got back, I weighed 160 pounds. I had malaria. I just felt awful, felt terrible. But what do? You know, I took my malaria medicine and all that. And finally got to feeling decent again, but I felt awful. Felt bad.
Well, Mr. George, if you don't mind, let's take a little break and start part 2 in a few minutes.
Okay.
Mr. George, I asked you a while ago how you kept your spirits up while you were overseas. I'm going to ask you about two specific things, and I want you to just kind of tell us a little bit about those events. Before you went overseas, did you spend some time in San Francisco?
Yeah, we went through San Francisco. That's where we shipped out of Camp Stoneman. And I met the prettiest girl there you nearly ever saw. And I thought to myself, if she and I could have a little party, I believe I could go to this war happy. Well, we had the party, but I didn't go to the war happy. But she was something else. She was the daughter of the circuit judge there in San Francisco.
Well, tell me about while you were in combat. I mean, you were in combat for 2 or 3 years.
3 years.
3 years.
Not in combat all of that time, but yeah, we were in combat 3 years.
In the combat area. Did they ever let you take an R&R? Did they let you leave that area and go to some other place?
Went to Australia one time for 2 weeks. Yeah, left New Guinea and went to Australia.
What was that like?
Well, great. I knew this girl down there. Now, Bear, I'll tell you, I wasn't married at this time. And I met her, she was a fine girl. She was a dentist's daughter. And anyway, had a good time. I thought to myself, if I ever get through this war, I'm gonna go back down there, but I didn't.
All right, when you got back to the States, you've already told us how old you were and where you landed and what you started doing, and that was to travel around the area. Were you finished with college at that point? Had you already graduated from college?
No, I hadn't. No. I'll get into that. Maybe one other thing before we get away from Fort Clark, Texas. Thought this was interesting. I was an A troop of Fort Clark, Texas.
Now, this is before you ever went overseas?
Yeah, before we went
Okay.
overseas, and down on the Mexican border. And we had a captain there named Johnson, but he was up in some kind of military class, and had a lieutenant named Laird who was running the company, the troop, as we called them. And I was at the officer club one day, having a drink as usual, and I was with the post commander's daughter, and I got a call. Said, they want you down to the stables right now. So I was wearing a winter cap with the summer uniform, which you weren't supposed to do. A lot of us did. Got down there, that's the first thing the colonel jumped on for, about my damn cap. And so then he said, I want to know what you put that pile of manure there for. Lieutenant Laird was standing right there. I hadn't put it there. He put it there. And I said, sir, I didn't. And Laird spoke up and said, yes, he did too. I thought, well, here's a man, who's got 2 kids and no money, and so I let it go at that. So the colonel says, Cunningham, tough old man, said, I'm gonna make a goddamn civilian out of you. I said, well, sir, that's a fate worse than death, but he said, I'm gonna send you to this outpost down in the middle of the desert and say, you can't handle it, but I'm gonna send you there. And I'll have an excuse to get rid of you. I said, all right. So he sent me down to Sanderson. That's a story within itself. Sanderson was someplace, right in the middle of the desert, right on the railroad. We were 5 miles from the nearest highway. We got our water and food. One of these cars that the railroad people run up and down the tracks in. That's what we were supplied. But it wasn't too bad there, but
And so he didn't make a civilian out of you?
Didn't make sense. In fact, truth about it is, went in the sentencing time crew. I knew the sheriff there, and we had a party at the sheriff's house one time, had a right good time.
Parties and women seem to be a common theme of your life, Mr. George, before you were married.
Well, I had some, yeah, you might say I had some of it, yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. When you got back from the service, when did you decide to become an attorney?
I decided to become an attorney if I ever got back while I was overseas. Surely I thought to myself, if I can get back and get a law degree, I can do a lot better than some of these fellas that are practicing for this court. But anyway, so I decided to go to law school.
Did you observe some court martials? Is that where you saw court while you were in the service?
Yeah, we had these courts were 3 to 5 man courts, and I was on several of them. And these prosecutors, defense counsel would come in, and some of them do a good job, some of them wouldn't, of course, like anything else. But I decided if I ever got back, I was going to law school. Well, I got back all right, but I had to finish my undergraduate work, and then I went to law school.
What kind of grade point average did you have as you started that? Do you remember?
I had a poor grade point average going to law school, yeah. Well, I had enough to get in. I had, as I said, back in the junior college, I was studying girls and athletics. So I had to raise my grades up. So I went to undergraduate school, and you know, I've forgotten how many quarters I went, but I made straight A's while I was in there. Got my average up, went to law school.
Did you have to take an entrance exam of any kind to get into law school then?
No, I didn't.
How did you decide where you wanted to go to law school?
Well, I didn't. I just going to UT. That's all there was to that. Yeah. I just never had any other question about where I was going because that's where I'd been to school.
Where did you meet your wife? And when did y'all marry?
Well, let's see. Ned McCarter's first campaign for governor. He opened his campaign on the courthouse.
But let's go back now. I'm talking about Miss Sue. When did you first meet Miss Sue?
Let me study about that. Well, of course, I knew her growing up. I knew her as a little girl. She was Tom Irving's daughter. I knew her as a little girl.
What was her full name?
Mary Sue.
And her maiden name?
Irving. Yeah. Mary Sue Irving. And so,
and when did y'all marry? And when did y'all?
Well, let's see. We married. I hadn't thought about that in a while. I had a chaplain overseas named Sarles, S-A-R-L-E-S. And when Sue and I decided to marry, I contacted Sarles, who at that time was living in Dallas, Texas, and asked him to come up and marry us. He did, in the Methodist church there in Dresden. And that was...
What year would that have been?
Gosh, I don't know.
Was it before you went to law school?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, we went to law school, and I didn't have any money. And by this time, Sue was pregnant, had George, and she worked in the dining hall. Some sort, she'd had dietitian training. She worked in the mess hall, and I worked in the library. Got 50 cents an hour working in the library. But it was a good job. And didn't have much to do, so I studied. All the time I was there, I studied. And I was #1 man in my class. That's the reason I was. I was in that.
You were the #1 person in your class at law school?
Yeah, #1 person in class in law school. That's the reason I was. up there in that library all the time studying.
Were you in the law review
Yeah, I was editor of the Law Review.
at UT Knoxville?
Yeah, yeah, sure was.
Now, I have been in your office many times, and there is a plaque that was in your office, and it was called the Order of the Coif.
Coif.
What was that?
That's an order, that's an honor society that's tough to get in. Somehow or another let me in. But
Was that from law school or in undergraduate school?
Law school. Order of the Coif, yeah.
Did you receive any other academic awards at UT Knoxville while you were in law school?
Not that I can recall.
When you were #1 in your class, did they have an award for that?
Yeah, they did, but you know what happened? I wasn't there for graduation. My family wanted me to come back to Weaver County, and they'd already qualified me to run for county judge. And I didn't stay for graduation. I went back home and started running for county judge. Had to run against Case Pentecost. Nobody in the world could beat Case Pentecost, but they already had me qualified to run for Case Pentecost. So I did. I worked night and days, get up daylight, go to bed at midnight. But I finally beat him, but that's how I beat Case Pentecost. At that time, it was paying, Case Pentecost made $1,200 a year, but I went in on September the 1st, or whatever year it was, and it had been raised to $4,000. That's what I earned, $4,000 a year.
Well, you were #1 in your class at law school. You would think you could have picked any place in the state to go practice law.
I had a lot of offers from these places.
Why did you select here?
I wanted to come home. That's the only reason in the world. And of course, my family wanted me to come home. My father was having problems, and Miss Georgia wanted me home with her, and so I just came.
What about law school? Were there professors there at the law school that were particularly influential in your life? Or?
Yeah, let's see. Dick Noel, Judge Jones, gosh, I can't remember all the names now, but yeah, they were.
What was your curriculum like there? Were
Well,
there required classes that you had to take?
Yeah. In fact, most of them were required. We had 2 or 3 electives, but most of at that time, and that's where I met Lee Winchester. He and I went in the same time. Lee Winchester from Memphis. Lee, a fine fellow. And Sonny Humphreys from Memphis. But
did you find that the law school there at Knoxville taught you how to practice or taught you more theory?
Theory. They just started the legal clinic my last year there. And when they started, it wasn't worth a flip. I knew the fellow that started wasn't much count, but it turned out later to be great, but it wasn't. We needed it badly. We didn't even know how to write a deed. They didn't teach things like that in law school, at least when I went.
You passed the bar exam first time you took it?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
Did you find it to be difficult?
Well, not too difficult. I remember I took it, I think it in March, before I finished in June. And passed it all right. I don't know what rank I was, but I passed it all right. Yeah.
So you started, when you came back out of law school, you were the county judge before you'd ever practiced any law?
Yeah, I was county judge before. Well, I went into, let's see, I came home. There was about a 6-month period there from the time I came home till I took office. And I went into Robert Jeter's office, didn't do anything.
And his office was located where, Mr. George?
Well, next door to where the city hall used to be, there in the middle of, what is it, Main Street?
In Dresden.
In Dresden. And Homer Bradbury was in the next office, and King Webb.
But you and Mr. Jeter weren't partners.
We were not partners, no.
Did you have a secretary?
No. We, the lawyers in Dresden shared one secretary. Let's see, when I came to Dresden, there were 25 lawyers in the county. Most of them weren't making a living, but they're all kind of lawyers. Of course, back in those days, you know, you could read law or something and get your law license. But by the time I got there, it would require, I think, 3 years. You know, it went from nothing to 2 years to 3 years to 4 years. But Homer was practicing. Homer, he's one of these 90-day wonders, but he was a hell of a lawyer. Yeah, he was a hell of a lawyer.
Well, if you didn't get any practical training in law school, where did you learn to practice law? Where did you learn how to write a deed?
I had to find out. I learned from various secretaries. You know, they tell you how. We had common secretaries around. And,
were there particular lawyers that you looked to for assistance, or were they pretty nice about helping?
I guess Bud Strawberry. Bud Strawberry was one of the leading lawyers there, and he was nice. Grooms Herod was in his office. He was nice about helping me, and I needed a lot of help. Go to him, and Harry Jones. Harry Jones was still practicing when I came there. He's one of the nicest men I ever knew. And he never did have a secretary, but he represented the L&N Railroad, had a lot of big clients. I never did know how he did. Well, go in his back office, and he on a desk there, he had files stacked as far as you could reach. And I'd just go in and say, Mr. Harry, I've got a question here, so-and-so and so-and-so. You know anything about it? Well, let me see. I've had a case sort of like that. Let me see. He'd reach in and pull one. I said, here it is. I never did know how. He didn't have any system except in his head. Yeah.
Tell me about your first day in the practice of law. Do you remember it? And your first client. Who was your first client?
No, I could. Didn't have any clients for a long time. I'll tell you about one of the clients I had that I remember particularly was a boy the other side of Palmersville on the Kentucky line. In fact, the Kentucky line ran through his back porch. He was a big farmer, had 300 or 400 acres of corn. And the Hudson Lime and Fertilizer Company, I think that's the name of it, has come, well, they put the poison on his land, and the boys made a mistake and killed all of it. And so we sued them. They wouldn't agree to settle, so we sued them. And got a judgment, got a pretty good sized judgment. I remember that, yeah. Nice try. Oh yeah, another case I remember particularly. Do you remember George Zarica?
Yes, sir.
He played tackle and I played in on the football team. But you know, he had that big hog operation between Martin and Union City. And George was afraid you never could tell where he was going, but he and I were good friends. And we shared a lot together. He married a Dodd girl, didn't he? Married Bonnie girl, Dodd, yeah.
What kind of lawsuit was it?
That was, yeah, that was on those hogs. The lady lived next door. Of course, he had 5,000 or 6,000 hogs. Of course, he did the best he could to keep it clean, but of course, terrible odor. And she sued him. And we had a lawsuit about that. So And
Did you win it or lose it?
well, sort of half and half. He had to do some things to control the order. I think he had to dig a big pond, and
So you didn't convince the chancellor that hogs didn't stink?
no, didn't convince it. No.
Well, going back to when you was county judge, tell me about that experience. And were you interested in politics before that? Or was your family involved in politics?
Not
How did that
really.
happen?
The only reason I ran for county judge, it didn't, as I said, there were 25 lawyers in the county, and I didn't have any money, and had to do something, and that paid $4,000 a year. So I ran. And fortunately, I won.
Was your dad political? Was he
No,
interested
he
in
was
politics?
not political at all. No.
So this is your first foray into politics. You ran for office and won.
That's right. Yeah.
Were you a Democrat or a Republican, Mr. George? As if I don't know the answer already.
Republican's a bad name as far as I'm concerned.
So you were a Democrat.
I was a Democrat.
Well, why were you?
You know, when I was a boy, we didn't have a half a dozen families in Greenfield that were Republicans. I knew every one of them. I mean, I just knew the families, yeah. We didn't have Republicans. But later on it changed.
So why were you a Democrat, Mr. George?
Well,
Besides the fact that everybody...
Of course, I guess the reason I was, that's what I was really a Democrat. And everybody, quote, everybody was a Democrat. But I believe in democratic principles. That's why am I one today? I believe in what we stand for, and not for what George Bush stands for.
Well, tell me about what it was like to be county judge. Was it an administrative position like it is today, or was there any judicial component to it?
All right, it's both. I was budget director, and also I was chancellor. They had a chancellor, but he had, 14 counties or something. It was very seldom there. And by private act, they'd given the county judge actions on domestic relations and contracts and a lot of things. So
Juvenile court, was that one of them?
juvenile, yeah, that juvenile. And I spent a lot of time being judge. I didn't spend a lot of time being running the business of the county, because each office ran its own business, generally speaking. Not like, they didn't have a director like they do now. If there was a director, I was it. But
Were most of your cases, did most of the cases that you were involved in have attorneys on both sides, or?
most of them did. I remember George Riley was there a lot, Bob Gallimore was there a lot, Luke Hennings was there a lot. Luke's still living. Did you ever know Luke Hennings?
I did not know him.
He was there a lot, and Mr. Harper and Gallimore, they had a partnership in Martin. Bob Gallimore and Mr. Harper. Anyway.
Tell me about a case that I find somewhat interesting. Tell me about how Homer Johnson appeared in your court and what happened in that case.
Well, Homer Johnson, I don't know that it was a case. Homer Johnson was part of the Johnson family that there was not just one woman. There was a woman and 2 or 3 daughters. All of them had a kid a year, every year, and they were all on welfare. And Homer came to me one time. They were not only on welfare, but we had to buy their coal and pay for their groceries. Homer came to me one day and said he wanted so-and-so. I said, Homer, I've done everything I can from you, just your old damn family. And they moved there from Carroll County. Carroll County cut them off, They moved to Wheaton County, and we finally cut them off. Anyway, that's how I knew Homer Johnson.
Now, the story is that I've heard, I want you to either refute this or tell me if I'm right about it, is that you ordered by court order that he be sterilized. Is that accurate?
Yeah, in a way. Of course, you couldn't do that, of course. But what I did was, we had some conversation. And in order to keep him on these free programs, I told him he had to have himself fixed. So I sent him over to the hospital over in Union City, and they fixed him. Yeah.
And that was the way he stayed on the till?
Stayed on the till, yeah. Yeah. In fact, I'd go to their house, squalid, didn't have anything. They'd cook a bowl of beans. Anyway, there's the Johnsons.
How many times did you run for office in Weakley County for county judge?
One time.
Just the one time?
Yeah, there was an 8-year office. And
okay.
When I was through, when I got through the 8th year.
You talked about how hard you worked. What was a campaign like? Was it a door-to-door, press-the-flesh type of a campaign?
Yeah, gosh, yeah. I tried to make every house in the county. And I'd go down, if a farmer was in the back field, I'd walk down there through the pride ground to talk to him. But anyway, yeah, it was.
Well, how much money would a person spend on a campaign for public office?
Well, if you didn't have any, wouldn't spend much. But I don't recall what I spent, but I spent more than I had. Remember when I got through, I went to Biloxi, Mississippi on a vacation. I had to borrow, I think I borrowed $1,000. And so I went to Biloxi, Mississippi on a vacation. But anyway.
Were there any milestones in your tenure there as county judge in the area of the administration of the county? What changes took place in the county, if any, while you were county judge?
Not really, not any. Not any.
At the nursing home, were there any changes there?
I appointed the nursing home committee. I remember I went out there, first time I went out there after I was county judge. That was the worst looking place I ever saw. And they had some cornbread in the oven and some beans on the stove, and it was dirty and filthy, and so I said to myself, we've got to do something, but you know, the county didn't have the money to do much. And I went to, she's state welfare commissioner, Christine Reynolds was her name. And I told her what the situation was, and they put us on one of the programs that we cleaned up that nursing home, because I appointed, I can't remember who the first person was I put in charge of it, but it was a good person.
Looking at old deeds back in those days, I've come across some, was it called the poorhouse?
They called it poorhouse, yeah.
When did that change?
Well, when I got to be county judge, as generally speaking, yeah. It was called the poorhouse, that's what it was called.
And instead of the poorhouse, it became known as the nursing home?
As a nursing home.
And that was during your tenure as county judge?
Yeah, yeah. And,
well, did you voluntarily get out of political office, or did you run and get beat?
No, I voluntarily got out. I made up my mind I wasn't, once the 8 years ago, I didn't want any more of it, so I wanted to go ahead and practice law, and I did.
Who followed you there in that position?
Mike Whelan, I think. Mike Whelan and then Casey.
When did you become field representative for the congressmen, and how did that happen?
Jerry Cooper. Jerry Cooper called me. Jerry Cooper knew my father. And I really don't know how he settled on me, but he called me one time. Said, I need somebody down there, eyes and ears in that area. I said, would you do it? And he told me how much he'd pay, and I said, yeah, I'll do it. That's most I'd never heard of. Yeah. So that's what happened. That's how it happened.
And Jerry Cooper was the congressman.
Jerry Cooper was a congressman. He and my father were friends. I knew when I was a boy, he'd been to our house and eaten dinner. Yeah.
What was the congressional district, and what did it encompass?
That's hard to say, but it was in Obion, Lake, Weekly, Dyer. He was from Dyer County. I can't remember all the counties.
And did you do that as you were county judge, or was it after you were county judge?
I did both, because I stayed on there with Fats Everett, and then stayed on.
Served in that capacity even for Ed Jones even after that?
Yeah, I did.
While you were the field rep for the congressman, did you meet some of the big name politicians in the country? And can you tell us who you met and been involved with there?
Yeah. You know, I looked at other. Fats Everett was congressman for a long time, and I was his field representative. Yeah, of course, I knew Gordon Browning. I knew Harry Truman. Harry Truman came down to Redfoot Lake one time, and I went down there with a group that met him, and of course Gordon Browning. I was trying to remember the governor's name. I knew all of them. Frank Clement, Buford Ellington, yeah. In fact, I was chairman of the County Judges Association during that period, and also chairman of the State Election Commission. So we ran the elections of the state. So.
When in the practice of law, were you a solo practitioner? When did you start having partners? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I guess when the son George came along, I guess. See, Bill Neese, I can't remember which was first. Bill Neese was in my office, and of course you were there. My son George, my son Tommy. So I never did practice much after I had a multiple law firm. I was about out of it then.
Well, tell me about some of your clients. I always kind of felt like you had the A-list clients in the county. How do you come about some of those clients, like the clay companies and the banks?
Well, I represented the Wichita County Bank and the People's Bank both. I don't know why I did. Just, of course, I was on the board of the Wichita County Bank, and of course, I worked when I was in Robert Jeter's office. Rob was a nice fellow, but he never did want to work. He'd always put the work off on somebody else, and he represented Spinks Clay Company. And every time he had something to do, he'd send me. Well, as he got older and sick, Clay Company hired me. And so that's how I got into Spinks Clay Company. And it was a very fruitful experience. I had a long and good experience at Spinks Clay Company. Spinks Clay Company They mined clay. The clay right there came from Weeks County clay mine. Mine clay, and they sell it to Standard and all these other people that make.
What kind of things did you do for the clay company in the practice of law?
Well, a lot of things. Ran titles, title search. There was a lot of it. We had property in Carroll County and Henry County and Weakley County, and I'd run titles for them, and I just do everything that had to be done.
Were you on a retainer from them?
I was on retainer. Yeah, sure was.
And also from the bank as well?
Well, no, I just did work for the banks on a piece by piece basis.
How did the practice of law change over the time that you practiced law, from the 1950 till you retired? What was different about it?
Well, we had more clients when I retired. As I said, when I started practicing, there were 25 lawyers in the county, and nobody had any clients. Bud Strawbridge had some, and Homer had a few. Homer fell. He was mowing his yard, and he fell and fractured a hip, and sent me up to his office to get something out of his file. He didn't have a dozen files in his filing cabinet. You know, most of us had a whole stack of them. He didn't keep any files. He didn't keep copies of letters and things. He just didn't do it. But he was a fine lawyer.
Homer Bradbury.
Homer Bradbury.
Who later became chancellor.
Yeah, he's a fine lawyer.
What about technology in the law practice? How did that change over the years?
Not much.
Did you have a typewriter when you started?
Well, there was one in the office. And we had this lady that did most of the deeds and wills and things for us. I was trying to think of her name, Miss whatever. She worked for all of us. So, well, I didn't do any typing, and Jane Butts worked for Homer a while, and she typed a lot, but she wasn't worth a flip. She couldn't spell. Had bad language. Yeah.
What would you estimate your income from the practice of law initially when you first started practicing, first 2 or 3 years?
Well, the first 2 or 3 years, we hadn't had much anything if I hadn't been county judge. But after I got out of the judgeship, I had a decent income. Maybe $7,000, $8,000 a year. I made enough.
Well, tell me about your sons. Are you proud that they got into the practice of law? Tell us who they were and
my son George.
When was he born?
1947.
Okay.
And Tommy was born in 1954. George practiced in the office for a while, and like the rest of us, wasn't making any money much. And he got a job teaching over at UT Martin. And he went up there and he was teaching there. Had an opportunity to go to St. Louis to some kind of a postgraduate course at Washington University. And he went up there, and while he was there, a group of men came down from the Rutgers area looking for maybe some young lawyers. And he met George, and that's how George got into Rutgers Law School.
So he's a professor or instructor?
He's a professor at Rutgers Law, has been for several years, yeah. And of course, Tommy came along and in office for a while, and as you know, ran for district attorney general and was elected and been there for several years.
You haven't mentioned one of your law partners, David Wells.
Yeah, thank you. David Wells, who's the son of my warm friend Ed Wells, who's a doctor there, was a fine student, a good lawyer. And in fact, when Ned was elected governor, he took David to Nashville with him as his personal attorney. So then from there he went into judgeships and so forth, never did come back. Yeah.
So tell me about what advice would you give to a young lawyer today just starting out in the practice of law?
Work. Yeah, work. You know, get good clients if you can, but when you get something to do it, and do it expeditiously, and don't put it off like a lot of lawyers are prone to do. And just do it and get it done. I thought that is Homer's failing. He'd have something to do and he wouldn't do it. When he finally got Patricia, his wife, in his office, by golly, he went to work.
You had a whole lot of law partners over the years, and all of them have gone on to greener pastures, maybe.
That's right.
Do you want to tell the listeners something about some of those people, or?
Well, you were one of them, and of course David Wells, and my sons. Let's see who had one though. I give good marks to all the lawyers I've had in my office except one, Charlie. What was his name? Charlie. He wound up over at Huntington. Wasn't worth a flip. I'd give him a job to do, he couldn't do it. I not only wouldn't do it, don't think he could do it. But you know, he wound up over at Huntington with some good clients. I think he did well, I guess.
But you had David Wells, who was a Court of Appeals judge now.
Yeah.
George III, who's a law professor at Rutgers.
Yeah.
Tommy Thomas, your son, who's a district attorney general for the 27th district.
Yeah.
Mike Malone was associated with the firm, chancellor, judge of the 27th district. And of course, I'm the general sessions judge. I think that says a lot about you, that you had all these young fellers that came in there, and we learned it from somebody, don't you think?
Well, you were there and you studied. Yeah. Go to the library and study. I'd say to you, I'd say, Tommy, I want to see you in that library now.
Let me ask you, this may be something more difficult to talk about, but I read your autobiography, and sort of at the end of that autobiography, you shared with the readers of that work that you had a bout with alcoholism. Would you share with the listeners how you overcame that, or how you dealt with that?
Yes, no secret. After my wife Sue killed herself on a Sunday morning, she said, I'm not going to church. And after church, I went by Connie Shines, who's my uncle, and had a cup of coffee. And got home, she was lying in the bathroom, and she shot herself. So I tried to deal with that, dealt with it pretty well, maybe, and got through that. I started drinking. I went all over the country. I went to Dyersburg, Memphis, Alamo, Cape Girardeau, Anywhere I could find a party, I went. And finally just got to drinking a lot, all the time. And I guess that went on for maybe 3 or 4 months. And I never shall forget this. I lived in Martin then. Tom had bought a house in Martin. And then he married this girl that had these girls. He needed more room, so he swapped out. I let him come to my house, I went to his house. I was living in Martin then. And so I got drunk. And I was there in the living room of that house at about 8 o'clock in the morning, I guess. I'd either been drinking all night or I'd started drinking. And Tommy and George, my sons, came in and said, "Dad, don't you need some help?" I had sense enough to say, "Yeah, but I don't know what to do." So George got on the phone, called some people. Next thing I knew, we were in the car going to Lakeside in Memphis. And I was there 28 days. I never shall forget being down there. They first, of course, put me in the detoxification ward, and that was tough. But of course, I didn't sleep much while I was there. I didn't eat much while I was there. But I made it through. And I talked to the counselor that discharged me. Said, "You think you can get out of here and not drink?" I said, "Well, I hope so." He said, "Not many lawyers do, I'll tell you that." Well, I said, "I hope so," and I did.
How have you maintained your sobriety? How have you done it?
Busy, working. When I first had alcohol fits, I'd go somewhere. I'd get in the car and go somewhere. Visit somebody I knew or go to some place I wanted to go. Go to the gambling boats. I did that a lot. But that's the way I did it. If I felt like I had to drink, I just did something else.
Did you ever use AA? Did you ever go to AA meetings?
Went to AJ a lot. In the early part of my sobriety, I never heard of AA, didn't know anything about it. But later on, I started going, I don't go much now, but I went for many years, 3 or 4 nights a week. And I'd recommend it to anybody that has a drinking or a drug problem.
Is it easier for you today?
Oh yeah, I don't have any problem today. I don't even have a desire today.
How old are you now, Mr. George?
I was born in 1918, 80, soon be 87.
Well, your wife, Miss Sue, passed away. Did you remarry?
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, when Ned McQuarrie kicked off his first campaign for governor there in Dresden, there were 3 or 4 young ladies from Jackson came to the kickoff, and Judy was one of them. And I and 3 or 4 of them and others went to the country club to eat dinner that night. At that time, the country club fed. And so later on, they went on to Jackson. 2 or 3 days later, I said, you know, I believe I'll call that girl. So I did.
And what was her name? What was her full name?
Well, she was a Lovell and then a Smith. She'd married a Smith. She was
So Julia Lovell Smith.
Julia Lovell Smith.
And when did y'all marry?
Gosh, I don't know.
I'll get you in trouble.
Yeah, we were March 13th. Married.
Was it around 1987, maybe?
Maybe. Maybe.
I'm trying to get you out of trouble here.
Yeah.
Do you have any grandchildren?
Yeah, Tommy. Yeah, Matt. Tommy's boy, Matt.
Who lives here in Dresden?
Yeah, Matt. He's on, has some step grandchildren. He's on a grandchild. Now, but have some grandchildren on Julia's side. Fine, we got fine children.
Well, let me ask you a couple of more questions. Tell us a little bit about your involvement in local affairs and civic clubs or organizations. Have you been involved in those things?
Well, I've been in the Lions Club and Chamber of Commerce. President of Chamber of Commerce once. Was in the Lions Club a long time. Generally speaking, that's the local organizations I've been involved in, best I can remember. But,
you were coach of the Little League, I know, at least 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, after. What was George? Was he your age?
No, Tommy.
Tommy. George played, I remember earlier, but then, yeah, I got to coach when Tommy came along. I think I coached some when George was playing, but not much. And
well, is there anything or anyone in your life that we haven't mentioned that you want to talk about or say anything about?
well, I don't know.
Well, is there anything that you'd like to tell us that I haven't asked you about?
Let me, one of my warm friends from the military, Colonel Philip Hooper, who at the time, during the war, he was an operations officer. And after the war, he went to work for the L&N Railroad and finally retired from the L&N Railroad. He lived in Dixon. But he was a fine person. He'd keep you straight. You know, he'd see me getting out of line something, he'd come shake me up, yeah. And he was, of course, close to Regimental Commander Colonel Cunningham, who was a first class something, but he was the colonel. And I never shall forget one time, we had a boy named Bruton. He graduated University of Georgia. One of these people that, because of physical makeup, he couldn't keep in step, just couldn't do it. And we had squadron calisthenics, 7 o'clock in the morning. They'd put the director up on this stage to direct the calisthenics. Well, they put Bruton over, he couldn't do it. And this fellow Cunningham came out on his white horse and gave him a going over. And I thought, you know, that man, he knew that this boy couldn't do it. He knew he couldn't. We went to Mexico one time, across the border to Mexico. And Bruton went with us. He's a fellow that, as I said, from the University of Georgia, bragged all the time about what he could do and how much he could drink and all that. Well, we got to, of course, what he'd do, he'd go and he'd get a drink and he'd keep it all night. He'd nurse it. So take a little sip and nurse it. And so down at this Mexican bar, every time he'd take a sip, somebody'd pour it full of liquor. Well, pretty soon he's drunk. So we called him Two Brew Bruton. So anyway, that has nothing here, but anyway, that's part of it.
Well, I'm going to ask you two questions. This one is maybe similar to what I've just asked, but I always heard this expression, if a turtle finds himself on top of a fence post, he didn't get there by himself.
That's right.
You know, and you have been an extremely successful man in this county and community, a great lawyer, a successful lawyer. Are there people that you would say helped you get where you are?
Well, a lot of people. Julie, one of them. My mother, I put her at the top of the list. And you know, I took lessons from a lot of people. Homer Bradbury, Bud Strawbridge, George Rowlett, Bob Gallimore. Bob was a hell of a lawyer. He just drank all the time. But he knew he was the best lawyer in front of a jury I ever saw. He was, anyway.
And I guess my last question for you, Mr. George, how would you like to be remembered?
Well, honest, forthright, friendly, I guess that's it.
I think those are great characteristics. Well, I've enjoyed the afternoon with you, Mr. George, and on behalf of the Tennessee Bar Foundation and the fellows of that foundation, we appreciate your time. We appreciate your sharing these stories and your life with us.
I was one of the early members of the Tennessee Bar Foundation, a long time ago. Yeah.